So, basic question first, are you Ukrainian?
Well, it's an interesting question. So I was actually born in Moscow, which last time I checked was still part of Russia. My parents were also born in Russia, so I guess not.
Are you a
But
billionaire?
who can say?
Are you a billionaire?
That one is very, very clear, absolutely not.
Okay, so we're going to talk about security and hacking in various countries in the US by many adversaries. But I wanted to ask you, since you're involved in so many of those countries attacking us and you're trying to defend us from all angles, what is the most impressive attack that you've seen in your career?
That's a great question. So most people would think that it would be the DNC hack, but the DNC hack actually is a technical hack. It was actually pretty simple and pretty typical of the intrusions we see day in, day out. Someone hacks in, via an email that they send you, what's known as a spearfish. It looks real, you click on it, and an attacker gets onto your system and starts hoovering data surreptitiously from your machine, and you're none the wiser. What was most impressive to me, and I actually was amazed that it got relatively little attention in the news, is a set of attacks that happened this summer, what were known as NotPetya attacks. And these were extremely destructive attacks where someone hacked into a company called Medox. It's a Ukrainian company, actually, truly Ukrainian. And they manufacture tax filing software. So if you're doing business in Ukraine and you want to file taxes with the government electronically, you can use the software. And someone, and the assumption has been there was also the Russians, hacked into this company and through an update to the software basically infected everyone that was using the software automatically, because the software had an auto-update capability, and delivered malicious payload that automatically destroyed not just the system that was running this Medox software, but it virally spread through the network and destroyed the entire network. And this was clearly directed by someone who wanted to do damage to the Ukrainian economy, and it hit a lot of Ukrainian companies. But one of the things that they probably didn't anticipate is that you also had a lot of multinational Western companies that were doing business in Ukraine, and as a result had to file taxes in Ukraine. So you had companies like FedEx, for example, that were hugely affected, and they just published their numbers that it would cost them 2% of their revenue that quarter, this attack. And we worked with a number of companies, many of them public, that were down for weeks. No email, no ability to use any of their computing devices, no ability to serve customers. Really, really devastating attacks that cost many of them hundreds of millions of dollars, in some cases billions of dollars. And this is really the new types of attacks that worry me, those that are destructive in nature, not just theft of information, not just theft of emails, but can really have huge impact to our way of life. And in some cases, can even impact healthcare, because some of the companies that were impacted were actually in the healthcare business. As a result, there were some surgeries that had to be delayed. People could have died as a result. So very damaging stuff.
Okay, so let's talk about the Russians first. Maybe you can tell us the story of your involvement in the DNC. How does it look? You get invited one day to look at the computers. What do you see? How do you find it? And how does it look from the day that you show up?
This is really interesting because most people know about what happened after we came out publicly last June, in June 2016, and announced that it was Russia. But actually, something that's not well known is that the US government had actually known for many months before we ever got involved and ever got the call from the DNC that the Russians were inside the DNC. So what we now know is that initially the Russians broke into the DNC in July of 2015. And shortly thereafter, it was actually picked up by an allied intelligence service. And this was reported in the New York Times that this was actually the British intelligence service who are monitoring the Russians. As you can imagine, intelligence services are spying on each other. They're trying to figure out what each others are doing. So they detected that the Russians had hacked into the DNC, and they notified the US government. And ultimately, it made its way through the US government bureaucracy, and the FBI placed a call into the DNC to let them know that the Russians are hacking them, except that they didn't really have a relationship, and the agent that was in charge of making the notification literally called the main number of the DNC, asked for the security guy. He was told that the DNC doesn't have any security guys, but they would be happy to redirect him to the help desk, which they did. And the individual that picked up the phone wasn't even a DNC employee. It was an outside contractor who literally thought it was a prank call and basically hung up on the FBI agent. The FBI agent thought that he did his job and moved on to doing whatever else he was doing that day, and basically there were some periods of time when the FBI kept calling and the DNC kept ignoring them. In fact, this individual at the DNC, who's not even an employee of the DNC, but that's sort of one of the what-ifs in history, that if they had listened back in those days and called us in earlier, or did other things to protect their network, maybe a lot of things could have turned out very differently.
So then they call you, you show up. How does it look? You show up and you start looking at computers and you see someone inside. How do you know it's the Russians even? How does it work?
Yeah, well, we didn't know at the time we were called in this entire backstory. So we showed up because ultimately the FBI actually 6 or 8 months later showed up on site and flashed a badge. And the guy actually said, "Oh my God, you really are FBI. Maybe I should pay attention." So he finally told DNC officials who thought this was important enough to bring in their lawyers. We had a relationship with a law firm that they were using, Perkins Coie, and they ultimately called us in to do an assessment of the network, essentially a health check to see if there's anything wrong. And right away, within literally minutes of installing our technology on their network, we picked up malicious code that was executing. We started looking at that malicious code, and we realized that this was very well known to us. It was an actor that we call Fancy Bear, which is the T-shirt I'm wearing here, representing that actor. In fact, CrowdStrike is not just in the security business; we're also in the T-shirt making business. But we make T-shirts of all our adversaries, and we have cool names for them. Maybe we can talk about that in a second. But we realized that one of the actors was Fancy Bear, which is an actor we had tracked going back all the way to the early 2000s and affiliated with the Russian military intelligence agency, the GRU. And there was a second actor in the network that was seemingly unaware of the first hacker group, which is an actor we call Cozy Bear, which we affiliate with another civilian intelligence agency, which is a successor to the KGB.
So let me get it straight. You come to the DNC, you look at the computers, and you see 2 different Russian agencies at the same time hacking and not knowing about each other.
Not knowing about each other, and the reason we know that they didn't know about each other is that they were literally going after same things. So one group would steal emails, let's say, on a particular day. 5 hours later, another group would come in and steal the exact same information. So clearly not very well coordinated. But this is actually, if you know a little bit about how Russian intelligence services operate, not unusual. There is, if we think that there's a lot of bureaucratic infighting in the United States, it's nothing like it is in Russia. It's really a dog-eat-dog world, and they're all trying to make themselves look good in front of their superiors. And in fact, they've been known on occasion to even sabotage each other's operations in order to make themselves look better.
So, okay, so you come and you see that, and you go to whoever invites you, and you say, there is a hack. What's next? How do you deal with that?
Well, this is another kind of interesting what if, because once we identified the intrusion, this was in early May. I believe May 6th is when we found it. Then we had a conversation with the DNC officials, ultimately the chairman of the DNC, who was Debbie Wasserman Schultz, and we said, look, we've got several Russian espionage groups in your network. They've been in there. One group has been in there since July. Another group came in last month in April, and they've already stolen a bunch of information, and we need to do a rapid cleanup of the environment to kick them out. And unfortunately, if you recall what was happening in May 2016, this was the end of the primaries. So Bernie Sanders and Hillary Clinton were still fighting for the Democratic nomination. The primaries were not yet over. DNC, as the committee of the Democratic Party, was obviously heavily involved in making sure that the primaries go smoothly. So they said, we can't do anything until the primary process is over. And by the way, we can't tell anyone because in Washington, everything leaks in about 5 seconds. So we have to keep this very, very quiet, and we just have to watch what they're doing. And in June, when the primary process completes, and whoever wins the nomination gets it officially, we will do the remediation event. At the time, this didn't seem as bad as it sounds now, because we really had not, no one did, including the US government, expected the Russians to not just steal information, but to actually weaponize it in the form of leaking. And espionage is the second oldest profession in the world, and everyone engages in it in one fashion or another. And we have seen previously campaigns being targeted. Famously in 2008 and 2012, the Chinese have hacked the Obama campaign and the McCain campaign and the Romney campaign. So this was not unusual. What was unusual is that they would start leaking it in order to try to influence the election, but that was something that no one really expected.
So effectively, you see data being stolen, and you just wait weeks until you
That
do
was
something
my
about it.
choice, but
Yes.
yeah.
So ultimately, ultimately, when did you actually stop it?
So in early June, the primary process was over. Hillary Clinton ultimately got the nomination, and that week we were ready to do full remediation because the network was so infiltrated. We basically had to cut off network access on a Friday night and rebuild it completely over the weekend. And when Monday everyone came in into work, it was basically clean computers, everything rebuilt from scratch. The network was essentially new.
Okay. How do you know it's the Russians? Give me
It's a
a
great
way
question.
to know that if I go to the computer and I know that it's actually Russians there.
So attribution in the cyberspace is actually not that different from attribution in the physical world. A lot of people sort of think, well, if you can't exactly trace back to the original machine that did it, you can't figure out who's responsible. And that's akin to saying that if there's a bank robbery and if you do not have the tire tracks going all the way back to the bank robber's house, there's absolutely no way for you to catch them. Of course, we know that's not true, that there's lots of other evidence, forensic evidence like DNA evidence and photographs and other things that are used to routinely catch bank robbers even when the track does not lead directly to their house. So in cyberspace, it's very much the same way. When you look at the totality of evidence and you don't look at just one particular crime, you look at the history of crimes that they've committed over the course of, in this particular case, over a decade. And you look at who the victims are, you look at other information that you're able to collect over time. At the end of the day, these are humans that are doing this. Even when you think about these intelligence agencies, in many of them, you have essentially kids, right? 22-year-old Army cadets that are doing this, whether it's in the United States or in Russia or China or elsewhere. They make mistakes. And the thing that concerns all of us, of course, these days as consumers on the internet is that there's a lack of privacy. Everything that we do is always recorded. Well, the one benefit of that is that for our adversaries, that's also true. Anything that they do on the internet is ultimately recorded. And if they made one mistake 10 years ago, it's ultimately preserved and someone can find it and connect the dots and identify who they are.
So by now, when you get a network that was hacked, how long does it take you to actually say this is the Russians, the North Korean, the Iranians? How long does it take for you to?
Well, usually very rapidly you have a very good idea of who it is. You have to do the effort to actually validate the evidence, make sure that this is not a false flag operation where someone is trying to pretend to be someone that they're not. But those things are actually more rare than you think. And when you look at the totality of evidence, it's actually really, really hard to pretend to be exactly like that other person. Yes, you can sort of, again, the physical world analogy, put a mask on. But if you're not replicating the exact tradecraft that they're using to get in, to move across the network, to break into stuff, to take it back to your own infrastructure, it becomes really, really difficult.
So in this particular case, you actually claimed publicly that it was the Russians. But they fought back.
Also not my choice, by the way. The DNC in this particular case, which is also very unique, asked us to come out publicly and acknowledge who this was. And we were happy to do it, of course, but it was ultimately their decision.
But they didn't take it easily. They tried to fight back by claiming someone else was behind it. They tried to fight in many ways. What was? Well,
there was a misinformation campaign that started the next day, effectively. And there was a blog post that popped up from a hacker claiming to be someone who was not clearly a Romanian individual that hacked the DNC. Of course, that individual later was proven not to actually speak Romanian. So that was a little bit of a problem from a tradecraft perspective.
And he claims he was the hacker trying to basically discredit your attribution to the Russians.
That's right. And not just in the DNC. A lot of people forget that there were a number of people and organizations that were hacked during the course of the election. DNC is the most famous one. John Podesta, the campaign manager, was independently hacked as well. And the DCCC, the Democratic Congressional Campaign Committee that works to elect Democrats to the House of Representatives, was also hacked. And we ultimately worked on that case as well and identified that Fancy Bear, the same group that hacked the DNC, was in there too. And when that came out publicly, this hacker declared, "Oh, I also hacked them too."
So tell us the story of the T-shirt, or Fancy Bear. How do you choose the names, and what does this particular one mean?
Yeah. So this name we gave to the group long before the DNC, as I mentioned. We've been tracking them for many years. And one of the first pieces of malware that had been discovered that was ultimately tied to this group was named Sophacy, just because of a particular word that was in that particular piece of malware. And when we name our actors, we try to come up with a kind of standardized taxonomy of names. So if it's a Russian nation-state actor, it will always be a bear, right? It's sort of a zoo of adversaries. If it's a Chinese actor, it's a panda, and so forth. There's one that's really interesting, North Korea. We call them a cholima. And if you don't know what a cholima is, it's actually a mythical flying horse, which is a national animal of North Korea. So most countries actually have real animals. North Korea decides to invent one. That's sort of par for the course of the regime. So we knew when we first came across this actor that the second part had to be a bear once we were confident that this was a Russian government-affiliated actor. And then there's a question of the first part, which is always kind of invented by the analyst that first works on that case. And it can be all kinds of crazy names. But in this particular case, the analyst is looking at this piece of malware and knows that it's called Sophacy by others in the industry. And the song from Iggy Azalea, I'm So Fancy, comes to his mind. The initial thought was to name it Iggy Bear. But we didn't really like that name, so we decided to call it Fancy Bear. And then the story behind the T-shirt is that last year we were going to one of the biggest security conferences, Black Hat, which is in Las Vegas in August every year. And usually we give out T-shirts of different adversaries that are interesting at those conferences. And it's literally the Friday night before the Monday start of the conference. And we realized we're so busy with all these different hacks that we hadn't really planned what T-shirts we were going to do. And it's kind of late now, and we said, well, it has to be Fancy Bear, right? I mean, this is the most well-known hacking group perhaps in history. But we didn't have an image created for them, so we literally called up a designer that works for us that designs all these things, and we're like, okay, we got to design something. Let's brainstorm. Over the weekend, we basically said, okay, you know what? It has to be because of Fancy Bear, Iggy Azalea Association. It has to be based on Iggy Azalea. In fact, there's an image of Iggy Azalea where she has her head in her hands, just like in this picture, and that was sort of the motivation behind it, except that the designer kept sending me different proof points of the T-shirt, and I kept coming back and saying, this doesn't look like a bear, you got to do something better. And finally, he was so frustrated, it was Sunday night, he's like, Dmitri, there's only so much I can do to make a petite pop star look like a bear.
But this name, Fancy Bear, adopted later on by people as, someone claimed to be Fancy Bear, right?
Well, it was actually the same group. In August of last year, they had hacked the World Anti-Doping Agency. This was right in the midst of the Rio Olympics when there was a huge doping scandal. And they started leaking test results on US athletes and UK athletes and others in order to try to prove that everyone is doping, not just the Russians. And in fact, they borrowed our name and called themselves Fancy Bears, not Bear. But
okay, so we spoke about the Russians, but there are more actors out there. What countries are actually playing in this sphere of cybersecurity right now that are, big players?
Well, most countries these days have significant cyber capabilities, but in terms of the countries that we worry about here, and if I were living in North Korea or Iran, my list would be very different. But in terms of our adversaries, it's really the same adversaries that we worry about in our geopolitical space in the physical world, which is Russia, China, Iran, and North Korea, the four actors that are our main adversaries. Does Singapore have significant cyber capabilities? Yes, they do. Do I worry about them attacking the United States anytime soon? No, I do not.
So you spoke about North Korea, which is also in the news a lot lately. And when they're in the news, they're in the context of war. And what we mean by war is weapons. So someone's going to send a missile. Are we at war with North Korea in the world of cybersecurity? And if so, do we need to declare one to actually go back to war? Or can we attack back? What is the rule of cybersecurity war?
North Korea worries me the most amongst all the threat actors that are out there because they're really essentially undeterrable, not just in cyberspace, but obviously in the physical world as they're marching towards a nuclear weapon. And most people are surprised that North Koreans have significant cyber capabilities. They've in fact been engaged in cyber going back to at least 2004, so at least 13 years. And just like anything else, you practice something long enough, you're going to get good at it. And one benefit that the North Koreans have had in the past 13 years is South Korea, which they've been essentially using as a free fire range, essentially attacking them day in, day out for the last 13 years with a range of attacks, both destructive attacks and espionage attacks, and essentially developing and improving their tradecraft and their techniques So now they're actually very, very good. And we have seen them, of course, attack Sony Pictures back in 2014 when Sony was releasing a film that was talking about an assassination of Kim Jong-un. In response, they essentially destroyed Sony's network and leaked a bunch of information. In fact, the Russians may have gotten the inspiration for leaking from that original hack. But one thing that worries me the most is as tensions are escalating in that region, and if the North Koreans start believing that we're actually about to attack them, whether we attack their nuclear facilities or perhaps even the regime itself, one of the ways that they're going to retaliate is asymmetrically. Cyber is one of the elements that they can do that with. And the thing that worries me the most is that they have had significant successes in penetrating our financial sector. In fact, some of the big bank heists you've heard about in cyberspace, like the heist in the Bank of Bangladesh, where they attempted to steal $1 billion, was in fact perpetrated by North Korea and was very well done technically. So they've been able to get inside these networks, and the difference between theft and destruction in cyberspace is literally a few keystrokes. So if you're in, deleting a file or stealing a file is not that different, and they definitely have the capability and the motivation to do something if they think they're about to get attacked.
So I guess a question that is true for all of those attacks. Are they really smart, or really stupid, or it's a combination? What should we do in a way?
So I think it's a little bit of both. Most organizations aren't prepared, most individuals aren't prepared for these attacks. But the reality is that the level of sophistication on the part of these threat actors most of the time is actually very minimal. Not because they don't have the capabilities to do some really spectacular attacks, but because they mostly don't need to. So people are surprised that the DNC was able to get hacked through a very simple spear phishing attack. The reality is that you're not going to bring a nuclear weapon to a knife fight if you don't need to, right? If you already have dominance in terms of your ability to get into a network. And that's exactly what we're seeing day in, day out, where most of these attacks aren't very sophisticated, but they work. And that's the most important thing.
So when, for instance, allegedly Israel hacks in the US, hacks into the Iranian nuclear reactors, and there's also some knowledge on how it happened. How do we know that the same thing won't happen again and again and again using the same codes? Like, what should we do after the hack?
That's a great question. So you're referring to something called Stuxnet, which is a piece of malware that was used allegedly by US and Israel to try to disrupt the Iranian nuclear enrichment program in Natanz. Very, very sophisticated piece of malware. And when it was first discovered, a lot of people said, well, this is like Caesar crossing the Rubicon. This is going to unleash all kinds of attacks on critical infrastructure. Our power grid is about to go down. This was, by the way, 6.5 years ago. And I had a debate, in fact, with one of those individuals that was saying this, and I was arguing the other side. Because the reality is that offense against those types of hard targets, and those targets are actually disconnected from the internet, so you have to really think hard about how you're going to get in there and spread without direct network connection to that particular victim. Really, really hard to do. Only a few countries are capable of executing those types of attacks. And just like any software, you have to remember that malware is just software. It's just built to do malicious things. You have to test it. And whoever did the attack on Natanz nuclear enrichment plant had to have the exact cascade of enrichment centrifuges that Natanz had to have it in the exact same configuration so that they could actually test their code and make sure it works, right? So that's not something that you can just do in your own basement. When people say, well, there's a really sophisticated piece of code out there, now everyone's going to use it, that's simply not true. And history, in fact, shows that it's not to be true. And in retrospect, it's really self-evident. Just because you are a user of, let's say, Microsoft Word doesn't mean that you're going to rebuild Microsoft Word tomorrow, right? This was built by thousands of engineers over the course of decades. It's not that easy to replicate. And the same is true with a lot of this malicious code.
So we spoke about North Korea, we spoke about Russians. What is Iran doing right now in this sphere? What are they doing that we should know about?
The Iranians are as active as ever. In fact, in some ways, they're more active than they had been prior to the nuclear agreement that was struck in 2015 between the six parties in the West, Russia and China, as well as Iran. And one of the things that we're seeing from them now is, ironically, as they're getting more integrated into the world economy, many of the sanctions have come down. They're able to trade again with the West. they're actually using cyber for economic espionage to get better trade deals by hacking into a company that they're trying to buy something from or sell something to, and figuring out what their negotiation strategy is, what they're thinking in terms of pricing the deal, and using that for their benefits. So in fact, they're doing a lot more than we've seen them do even before the agreement.
So it sounds to me up to now that we spoke mostly about countries against countries. Are there also smaller, as in companies that attack companies that you get involved with? And if so, what should people in the room do if they're a business that's big enough to be vulnerable, but maybe not a country?
So there are sort of three types of threat actors that we face. So the nation states we've talked about, criminal groups, and most of them are really organized criminal groups. Think traditional mafia, but in cyberspace, individuals coming together, organizing and distributing different types of attacks to steal ultimately financial information, whether it's to break into your bank account, steal your credit card, steal your identity, and so forth. And then there are hacktivist or terrorist groups that are just interested in disruption for whatever political or personal grievance that they may have. In the criminal space, you certainly have sometimes companies that are trying to hack a competitor. The reality is that it's pretty rare. Most of them get caught, and the penalties for that are pretty egregious. So you can spend 10, 15 years in jail for doing something like that. So most of the time, it's not worth it. But occasionally, you do see that.
So it's pretty alarming. And there's one defense which would be faster than the other guy, so the bear is going to catch him rather than you. Another one is just lower your, be under the radar, so maybe they are going to skill. What would be your advice to people who are saying, I don't think I can do anything because it seems like if they are after me, I'm done?
Let me say something about the bear analogy, because this is a popular analogy that's been used for years in cybersecurity. You don't have to be very good, you just have to be better than your competitor, and an opportunistic hacker will move on and attack your competitor because it's ultimately a risk-reward equation. And the reality is that works very well for financially motivated threat actors like criminal groups. It does not work at all for nation states, because if the bear really wants you, it doesn't matter who else is running. Just using the last election as an example, if they really wanted the DNC, it didn't matter what other political organizations had in terms of security. They were going to go after the DNC, and they were going to keep going until they ultimately got in. So that analogy doesn't work. What does work is actually being a little bit paranoid and operating under the assumption that someone's already inside your computer, inside your network, and hunting for them aggressively, right? Actually starting to ask questions of, if I were a hacker inside my network, where would I be? Where would I hide myself? Because the reality is that hacking is not an instant business. A lot of people say, cyber works at a speed of light. That's a complete nonsense. When you break in, let's say I get you to click on a link that I sent you, and I get into your network, I still have to figure out what that network is. And anyone who has started ever at a company and got a computer and is trying to figure out where are the different resources, how do I set up my email account, where do I find information about how to connect to the VPN, and all those sorts of things, that takes time, right? And you're getting help from that company, presumably educating you. Imagine doing that without any help whatsoever and a large enough network. It's going to take you days, if not weeks, to figure out what's going on, where's the valuable information, how to get it. And ultimately, that's the weakest link. That's where you have the advantage of, this is your terrain, you should know it better than the attacker, and you can identify them once they're already in. Preventing them from coming in is next to impossible, but finding them once they get in is definitely very doable.
So the assumption that everyone should have here is that they're already being hacked, and now it's just how do you handle the day after? That's basically.
Well, hopefully the minutes and hours after, if you're good enough. And ultimately, the goal is to prevent them from accomplishing their objective.
So at least it's not turn off your computer and take the cable off.
Well, there are actually 3 rules to get to perfect computer security, and I'll share them. They're very sensitive, so I hope no one shares them outside of this room. But the first rule, of course, is not to connect your computer to the network. The second rule is to not power on your computer, and the third rule is not to buy a computer. Perfect security.
Okay. Let's take 2 or 3 questions from the audience, since we have a few minutes. I can't see the lights. Yes, second row.
Are we doing any sort of offense? Are we doing any sort of offense? Going back after people, and does that ever work?
It's a great question. So, I mentioned that the four actors I care about in cyberspace from a nation-state perspective: Russia, China, Iran, North Korea. They're not the only countries. And if you were to rank countries in terms of the best capabilities, the U.S. would be far above any of the others. The difference, of course, is that the United States traditionally constrains itself a lot more from doing these types of operations. So, for example, one thing that the United States does not do is economic espionage, actually for very practical reasons, because we don't have a lot of state-owned companies like China would, or Russia or Iran. We have a hard time figuring out that even if we had stolen a very valuable trade secret from a foreign competitor, who would we actually give it to? There are hundreds of companies here, right? So for that reason, we don't do it. But we do engage, of course, in very aggressive collection of intelligence against foreign adversaries, and some of the Snowden disclosures, of course, have shown us what the United States is capable of doing. But in terms of retaliating to cyber attack and cyber, that's not really effective. The U.S. government's policy is actually not to do that, but to actually look at the full range of power that you have, from financial sanctions to even traditional military power, and respond based on effects. So in 2011, the Department of Defense published a strategy that basically said that we're going to look at what the effect was. We're not going to care about how that effect was accomplished, whether it was done through cyber or not. So, for example, if there's a cyber attack that takes down a nuclear power plant, we're not going to limit our response to a cyber attack, right? Because the adversary, frankly, may not be vulnerable to cyber for various reasons, because they're perhaps, like North Korea, more backward power that's not very well connected. We may very well retaliate against their grid with a JDAM, right? So that's sort of the strategy: is you look at what was done to you and how do you reciprocate proportionally using all the capabilities that you have at your disposal.
Other questions? I can't see. I want to see if there's anything above. There you go, on the left.
That was brilliant. Thank you so much. Using a sort of comparison to nuclear, there's a nuclear clock that goes to midnight. How close are we to midnight? And given the fact that we're dealing with, essentially, an analogy would be to radiation, the political fallout of the democratic hack, we're already suffering. So how dangerous, how far into this are we? How at risk are we?
So I don't like the nuclear analogies in cyberspace because, frankly, it's not the same thing. We talked about North Korea, and I worry a lot about cyber attacks from North Korea. I worry a lot more about nuclear attacks from North Korea. Let's be very, very clear. The two don't even compare. So one of the things that's actually really, really hard to do in cyberspace is to achieve physical world effects. Yes, you can take down a computer. Actually making something blow up is incredibly hard, and in most cases not even possible today. It may become easier in time as more things become interconnected, but today is very, very difficult. And I think one of the mistakes that the US government actually made years ago is to overly focus on trying to do kinetic things in cyber. So we created something called the Cyber Command. There's a military agency that's now a combatant agency that can be used by the military in the times of war. And what our adversaries have done really well, and particularly the Russians, is realize that this is ultimately about information. And in fact, the first cybersecurity doctrine that was published by the Russian government was published in 2000, just when Vladimir Putin came to power. And it was all about information and protecting information and using information as a threat. And one of the things that it basically said is that what they consider would be an attack on Russia is a blog post that is accessible by the Russian population that is critical of the Russian government. And of course, at the time, the US government completely laughed at that and said, well, that's not a cyber attack, that's just free speech. And I think the Russians are getting the last laugh in that particular discussion.
Let's take two more questions, one from here and one from this side. I saw that there was one, Scott, in the back.
My question is that because this stuff is becoming more and more popular in public media, and like all good technology, it gets cheaper and cheaper. When you look at software as or software for sale, you got companies like Pegasus that have been out for years that were like $650,000, $750,000. Is this stuff going to become so cheap that people can buy the malware and the hacking software that consumers are going to have to be worrying about this?
Well, it's already cheap, so you can go and buy a sophisticated piece of code, piece of malware for $1,000, $2,000. So anyone in this room literally can afford it. Don't recommend it. It's illegal. But it is cheap. And in fact, one of the most interesting things has been the evolution of the e-crime ecosystem, because just like on Wall Street, people realized that the more successful businesses were not those software companies that were selling perpetual licenses to software. So you would pay some amount of money, you would get it, and then you could use it in perpetuity. But those that were selling it as a service and were doing annual subscriptions. So nowadays, it's actually becoming very, very hard to actually buy a piece of malware where you get as a service, where the criminal will say, tell me machines you want to deploy it on, and for a monthly fee, I will do it for you. It turned out to be a much better business model, but for legitimate software companies as well as criminals. So we're seeing a lot of that these days.
That's a business, like all businesses. You pay, there's customer service, there's discounts for students, all of things. Let's take one question from this side.
You talk like you know it very well. Good customer?
I'm curious, in the Cold War, where there was espionage between the Soviet Union and the United States, there were individuals on both sides that protected the interests of their sovereign nations, but almost interfaced in a way. There were double spies, there were double agents, there were relationships. Our side knew their side. Often there might be contact. So I wonder, in this new type of espionage, do you know the counter players and who they are? Do you see them? Is there a mutual respect for skills? Or is it completely behind a digital wall and you have no idea who the people and personalities are?
No, you do know. And certainly on the nation state side, it's actually the same players, right? It's the new KGB, it's the GRU, and some similar agencies across the world. So the players haven't changed at all. They just have younger help that is more technically savvy, that is able to execute these operations. But it's the same game playing out now that has been playing out not just over the course of the Cold War, but really for centuries. The difference is that it's so much easier to do, and it scales a lot better, right? To send in 20 spies into the United States would cost so much money, so much effort, would take literally years to prepare and train them. Now you can do it from the comfort of sitting in Beijing, sitting in Tehran, et cetera. That's what makes this much more dangerous, and you can do it with literally thousands or tens of thousands of victims.
Thank you so much, Dmitri.
Thank
and
you.
I know that if everyone applies your idea of turning off the computer or shutting it down, you can still sell T-shirts. So that's good for you. Thank you so much. Thank you.
Thank you.
Really.